My name is Matt Graeber. I'm a threat researcher at Red Canary. Been there going on about 2 years now. And I'm a defender with an adversary's mindset. So a little bit of history for me. I was active duty Navy for some time as a linguist. Got out, started InfoSec. Started my career in doing mostly offensive stuff like red teaming. And then transitioned, did some malware reversing for a little while, and since then I've been primarily working as a defender. And what's cool about that is that I'm able to apply an adversarial mindset to everything that I do in detection, including detection engineering, which is going to be the focus of our talk today. Oh, and a cool thing is my very first InfoSec talk was right here at B-Sides Augusta, the very first one in 2013. And so, it was my mentor, Chris Campbell, who brought me in and really encouraged me to present. And that's when we presented the concept of living off the land for the first time. So it's just crazy to think like how much things have changed and also how many things have not changed at the same time. So yeah, it's been a wild ride. All right, so what does this talk about? I'm going to attempt to do 3 things. We're going to define a framework for an adversarial approach to detection engineering. So what do I mean by adversarial? I mean applying an adversary mindset to building better, more resilient detections. Getting as much coverage as we can or shelf life out of our detections. Because detection engineering, it's not, and there's no end state to it. It's always a process. And the more coverage that we want to squeeze out of any of our detection analytics, it's best to apply an adversarial mindset, to be thinking about how can we build good initial coverage and then bypass that, rinse, repeat. And then we're going to actually apply this framework to a specific attack technique. In this case, MSHTA. So MSHTA is a built-in utility in Windows signed by Microsoft that allows an admin or an adversary to execute script code, specifically VBScript or JScript. And as we'll discuss and discover, some variations thereof as well. And I thought MSHTA would be a good example because it's a relatively simple utility. It has a ton of options that we as detection engineers would want to consider, but it's also relatively tightly constrained in scope for the length of time that we have here. And also I want to encourage all of us, certainly myself included, just to get in the process of asking more and better questions. And so we'll discuss some of that as well. So some aspirational goals of detection engineering in general, not even applying like the adversarial mindset per se. You'll hear me harp on this all the time, and I have to remind myself of this if I ever start to get overwhelmed with a technique that is initially too broad. And many of you are familiar with the MITRE ATT&CK matrix. Some of them are really freaking broad. Like there's a sub-technique for PowerShell. Like there's nothing PowerShell can't do. So like if someone was to approach me and say like, hey, Matt at Red Canary, do you detect PowerShell? I mean, like I can't in good faith just say yes without caveats, right? It's so broad, and so we need to start getting into the mindset of scope and being deliberate about the scope that we define and build coverage around. And another goal is to continually increase our confidence in our ability to detect an attack technique. So I've already mentioned once, I'll say it several other times, detection is a process. It's not an end state. And so the best thing that we can do is just over time gradually increase our confidence. Like even if we're going to apply some of the techniques that we discuss here today, in approaching things with an adversary mindset, finding all the variations of any given technique, we're still not going to have absolute confidence in 100% coverage. Like that's just not possible. Like this is one of the reasons like security researchers are so great anyways, because they're continually challenging our assumptions. And it's not my full-time job to be a security researcher, so like I don't have the time or resources to be challenging all of the assumptions of our corpus of detection analytics. So there's definitely give and take. Like as detection engineers, we can start that process, but many of the security researchers out there can help, and also like malware developers, like can help build up that confidence over time. So we do our best. And then detection coverage lies on a foundation of assumptions. All right. Again, this comes back to confidence. Like we can only know so much. Like there are known and unknown assumptions. The known assumptions, ideally, when we build detection analytics, are things that we would document. And the way I think about those known assumptions is those are anything that we document that we are saying deliberately fall outside of the scope of our detection analytic, all right? And that's okay. So if attackers started coming around and abusing all of those assumptions that we don't have a coverage for, again, that's okay. We can go focus on that some other time when it's prioritized accordingly. But we can't just cast a wide net and try to detect everything. We have to be realistic. Confidence is derived from our ability to define those clear scopes again and measure coverage within that defined scope. And so with regard to measurement, we're going to be talking about testing and validation quite a little bit later on. Once again, I'll be harping on this. Detection is a process and not an end state. If you can confidently say that you detect PowerShell, are you just going to go move on and just never care about it again because like you have some arbitrary confidence that you'll always be able to detect it in all cases? Like that will never be the case. Okay, so now I'm going to describe the methodology that I apply in many cases to detection engineering, applying the adversarial mindset. Now, you're not going to have to follow any of these in sequence. Think of this just as like a cycle. And I'll go back and forth between them depending upon the scope of the technique. But the first step is to define an initial scope. And this can be really, really easy, and we're going to walk through this process. Step one, why don't we go to MITRE's webpage and actually learn what this attack technique is. And I'll show you how I kind of read between the lines when I'm defining an initial scope for a detection analytic. We'll use things like open source intel, but then we'll also transition into the next stage, which I call mapping, or like identifying key terrain. This is where we can apply concepts like static and dynamic reverse engineering to identify the technical components that that make up that attack technique. So if we can understand the actual components, the relevant executables, the DLLs, any specific like consistent network connections, registry modifications, if we can be confident that within our scope those things are not going to change, then that's where we can really start focusing our analytics, because that's where we can apply those detection choke points. Because if any of those components are not successful, well, they're required in order for that attack technique to be successful. So if we can focus our detection optics on any one of those finite technical components, then we can prevent ourselves from expanding our scope unnecessarily and also really hone in on adversary behavior. The next step is classification. So here's where we will identify technique variations. And you'll hear me say this a lot. Think of a technique variation as like a sub-technique. So if we keep talking about scope, right, we want to keep start with a relatively expanded scope, but try to constrain it appropriately over time. And so a technique variation is, we're going to be talking about MSHTA. There's a handful of different ways to invoke MSHTA, right? You can use it to download an HTA file remotely. You can execute it from disk. You can execute it inline, right? There's all these different ways, and there's some additional ones we'll get into. I consider all of these to be technique variations. And so we can identify those through open source intelligence, right? Like whatever the adversaries are doing, like if we're talking about coverage, like that should be the minimum set of coverage that we have is against in the wild threats. But we'll also want to go against like theoretical variations as well. For those theoretical variations, this is where we extrapolate those variations through reverse engineering and also applying that adversary mindset to understand what an adversary has direct or some level of control over for each one of those variations. And we'll go into some examples. Next, this is where we really put our adversary hat on and consider what an attacker has direct control over. All right, so I mentioned that with MSHTA, you can execute a script locally on disk. Well, does that script have to have a specific file extension? MSHTA.exe, does that have to be MSHTA.exe, or can that be relocated, renamed, right? So we'll go into this and put our adversary hats on and think about all the ways that we control so many things that might challenge some defender assumptions. Next, we'll apply everything that we learned previously and tie all of that to any relevant detection optics, right? Are there process start events, module loads, network connections, all the stuff we're typically accustomed to, but it's going to be more tightly constrained to what we've learned through our research process, and we're just going to be that much more confident as a result in those detection artifacts and not make as many assumptions as we would have if we just detonated a sample in a sandbox and observed in like a Procmon trace what popped out on the other end. This is definitely more of a deeper, more holistic approach. Next is to validate. So this is where we're actually developing code. I mean, if we were a red teamer, we'd be developing a red team tool to leverage this technique. But as detection engineers, think of it just like we're building like unit and functional tests to test this one technique. So we're taking all of the technique variations that we identified, and we're baking those into code, and we're implementing parameters that allow a defender or a detection engineer to flip all those bits that an adversary would have available to them as well. And then we can write unit tests and functional tests on top of that to really measure our coverage. And I've got some code that I'll show you that we use to do that. And then rinse and repeat. So again, this is a cyclical process. You may have gotten to the last step of validation only to discover or realize like, oh, yeah, there's this one additional variation that we might want to get coverage for. So you may have to do some more reversing, some more testing, some more open source intelligence, and repeat this whole process until you're confident that you've defined your scope appropriately and can move on. All right. So I think we can all collectively just get better at asking questions. And the general this morning, I think, made some good points about like challenging assumptions, and this certainly applies here. So this is like the canonical question that is very reasonable from like, say, a prospective customer, or the latest threat drops on Twitter. There's a whole lot of FUD around that. Maybe malware authors are starting to weaponize that, and so there's legitimate concern. Hey, vendor, do you detect this thing, right? Well, of course, you would love to give a confident yes answer, but many of us know that's usually not possible without caveats, all right? So do you detect MSHTA? So, well, what do we mean by detect? This is not what I'm going to be saying to the prospective customer. This is like what I'm thinking in my head, because I don't want to be like, well, actually, like, do you actually know what MSHTA is? Like, it's not, it's complicated. It's not that easy, all right? So what do we mean by detect MSHTA? What do we actually need to give that affirmative yes or no, do we detect it? Well, the next question I would ask to myself is, well, what is MSHTA? Like, I know intuitively what it is. I know that adversaries abuse MSHTA.exe, but is that it? Or are there other avenues of executing HTA script code? I don't know, but we'll investigate that. And what is required to see MSHTA based on the scope of my specific definition? So you see I've highlighted detect and see. So my philosophy is you can't confidently detect something if you can't confidently see it in the first place. And this is what identifying those technique variations is so important for, is and identifying the relevant optics for each variation. So if you can't see what those would look like in your optics, then you're not going to be able to confidently discern benign from non-benign in the first place. So we have to have good optics coverage in order to have good detection coverage. And then what is required to discern benign from non-benign? In my mind, it's generally easier to scope the set of benign behaviors than it is to scope non-benign. And when I say non-benign, I'm including suspicious and malicious categorizations. Right? Suspicious implies some ambiguity, whereas malicious is like, yeah, that's overtly bad, that we can all agree on. Right? Next, if we want to confidently label something as malicious, is there any supplemental data beyond the original scope of our optics that might be used to enrich the event so that we can be more confident that something actually is malicious, so that we're not just generating false positives all day? So do you detect MSHTA? Heck yeah, I do, but with some reasonable caveats, all right? All right, so let's apply this methodology. So I mentioned the very first thing that I do in the scoping phase of this adversarial approach is like literally just go to the website, MITRE ATT&CK. All right, so let's read between the lines here a little bit. So first thing that popped out to me is MSHTA, all right? That first question was that I had to myself is, what is MSHTA? Well, it says here, adversaries may abuse MSHTA.exe to proxy execution of what? .hta files. Okay, those appear to be Microsoft HTML application files. And that's nice that they have a link there so I can go maybe reference that and learn what the heck these things are in the first place. But some questions I have already are, is it just MSHTA? Or is MSHTA maybe just like a wrapper for some other core, like maybe like functionality built into a DLL that I might be able to reference somewhere else? And then .hta files, is that it? Or can you supply other file types, file extensions? I don't know yet. So, and JavaScript and VBScript, okay? I've seen that a lot in the wild, but is that it? I don't know. And what is JavaScript and VBScript in the context of MSHTA? So we'll investigate that. Apparently, you can also execute inline scripts, and they give a cool example of that there. They can be invoked directly from URLs. So right there, I see two unique technique variations: inline script execution and execution from a URL. So again, think of those as like sub techniques in MITRE parlance. Where were we? Okay. And then MSHTA stood out to me, right? Does it have to be MSHTA? Can MSHTA be renamed, relocated to notepad.exe? I don't know. It's certainly worth trying and building some test coverage around. This stood out to me. So I'm like trying to think as a defender, if I was to build some like command line coverage around this, like is VBScript always going to be consistent? Or are there other options? I mean, it mentioned that JavaScript is supported, so what would that look like? And are there any others? I'd like to investigate that, independent of if they're abused in the wild or not. And then lastly, this stood out to me. This might be something that I might want to investigate the validity of, whether or not it bypasses application control solutions. Okay. So next, we're going to move on to open source intelligence and actually see how things are being abused in the wild. And as I look through all these, again, I'm trying to enumerate those technique variations. What stand out to me as like unique features of each procedure being executed here. So procedure, like TTP, techniques and procedures, we're looking at specific procedures here, particular instances where the techniques are invoked. So this first one here looks like that, that inline script execution paradigm. This looks a little bit different. Like in the one in MITRE, it had VBScript. So this one has JavaScript : and then script code goes in there. Again, I'm going to ask, are there any additional script options that I can supply there? Is there anything else in that script code that might be required? So as a detection engineer, what I really want to get to the bottom of is what are the things that an adversary has the least amount of control over? So in the case of inline script execution, is it required to have the script engine : script code in there? If so, I might be able to key off of that, but I can't be confident in that detection analytic logic unless I capture the set of all possible script engines. And so we'll investigate what those are comprised of. All right, next. This looks like being downloaded and executed from a URL. This one is a variation of something that we did see in the wild, which I thought was really interesting. I don't recall if it was an actual CRL file, but what's really interesting, and this will come up in a little bit, is you can embed HTA scripts in any arbitrary file format you want, and MSHTA will read it from the end of the file. So you can just tack it on to any file type you want, including a CRL, a certificate revocation list, which is probably going to be signed anyway. So there's potentially really good evasion opportunity. Okay, this one was really interesting when I first saw it. I was scratching my head a little bit, like how this even works. But it should make sense once we start reversing this, how this is possible. But you see that the syntax is somewhat similar in the sense that the script engine is there. So script engine : right? So I'm noticing these patterns as a detection engineer. The difference is the syntax is a little bit different, that follows a : and it's also run DLL 32 executing, which is super interesting. Okay, I just made this one up, but this was like a theory that I had, like what would prevent someone from renaming MSHTA to notepad.exe and instead of evil.hta renaming it to notes.txt. Is that possible, right? We don't have to just rely on open source intelligence, like we're also intelligent ourselves to create hypotheses that we could easily test. Whoa, sorry. Okay, some other ones I'm just throwing in here for reference. When I was researching this, again, this is where like security researchers are constantly like challenging our assumptions. This was a cool one, lethal HTA. So I didn't realize that HTA was also an implemented COM object, which means that HTA itself actually made for a great potential lateral movement technique. So this is something that we might want to consider in our research and our tests as well to build out coverage for. And then finally, I've already mentioned this, so a polyglot file is one file on disk that represents different formats simultaneously. So this was a really cool article where, again, it turns out you can just append HTA content to any file type, whether it be a PE, a certificate revocation list, like it doesn't matter. MSHTA just wants to read it from the back of the file. So there's some really interesting evasion opportunities in that scenario there. So we're taking our notes and we're annotating all these different technique variations, and all these variations are going to have their own distinct detection scope. There may be some overlap, but many of these look different because there's going to be different detection optics unique to each one of these variations. All right, so here's the fun part. Actually digging in and learning a little bit about how these things work, identifying the technical components. So I'll be glossing over a lot here, but it turns out like if you just throw out MSHTA into IDA, it's a very, very simple wrapper for the run HTML application export function in MSHTML.exe. Like that's all it is. It just wraps that function. When I annotated the parameters or the arguments that were being passed to it, what stood out to me, it was interesting. These 4 arguments mirrored the function signature for if you want to write any function that you intend to implement for run DLL32. These are the parameters that you would implement in your function. And that's what I was seeing in IDA. And so it was cool that using that information, I was able to arrive to the same, like a similar conclusion to what was revealed was being used in the wild that, what was it? Yeah, the run DLL32 instance. Like it didn't really make sense to me at the time how that was even possible, but now that I could confirm in IDA that run HTML application was indeed designed more or less to be used with run DLL32, a security researcher or malware author at some point had the same realization and started abusing that for probably evasion reasons. All right. So we've expanded the scope of our detection analytics a little bit, right? So we started with MSHTA.exe, which was mentioned in the MITRE website, and now we've extended it to run DLL32 as well. All right, so here's what we've identified thus far. Run HTML application in MSHTML.dll, I consider to be the lowest level interface to the execution of HTA content. Like if you go and reverse that function, like it's very complex, there's a lot going on, but sometimes we have to draw a line in the sand and say like enough is enough. Like is an attacker going to go to any lower level than that function to execute HTA code? That's probably unrealistic. So here's where we could probably draw that line in the sand and not go any deeper than what we did. Can run DLL32 be used to interface with HTML application? Well, malware authors already confirmed that for us, but if they hadn't, we already had that suspicion anyway based on the implementation of run HTML application, how it implemented its parameters. What other built-in OS components reference run HTML application? So is it just run DLL32 and MSHTA? So we'll investigate that. And considering an adversary could just call run HTML application directly, what would prevent them from just implementing their own code to call that function instead of using the built-in utilities? So first I would ask myself, like, is that actually being done in the wild? And what does it buy an adversary to do that? That just because I've come to the conclusion that it's unrealistic that they would do it doesn't mean that they won't, but it helps me scope my detection analytics. So because I came to the conclusion that it doesn't really make sense for an adversary to do that because they would have already had arbitrary code execution. Why would they want additional HTA code execution on top of that? then I tell myself, okay, I'm just not going to worry about that. It's not going to be in the scope of my detection analytic, and I'll move on. If they start abusing it later on, then I'll start caring and maybe focus on that, but I don't care about that right now. All right, so would not scoping this constitute a detection miss? And I would say no. If an adversary started abusing the run HTML application using their own custom code, I would say no, we didn't miss it because it was a documented assumption, right? So we didn't catch it, but it didn't actually miss our detection analytics because it wasn't in our scope. All right. So if it's not in scope, then you just document that as an assumption accordingly. All right. So this is a really silly thing I do, but it's really effective. So this answers the question that I had here of what other built-in OS components reference run HTML application. So this, I'm just constraining my search in PowerShell to the system32 directory, but realistically, I probably just do this throughout the whole file system. I'll say, show me all EXEs and DLLs, and then select string is like the equivalent of grep that have the string run HTML application as both a Unicode and an ASCII string. And then if anything came up besides these two here, then I would dig into that, like rinse, repeat, throw that thing into IDA and try to figure out if this is something that an attacker could actually abuse. So this was a good sign for me that it only returned what I expected, MSHTA and MSHTML.dll, the two components that I had already identified. But I would encourage anyone to do this. Like, again, this is kind of silly, like just grepping for strings. But it's, I have found it to be extremely, excuse me, extremely effective in scope. All right, that's better. All right, so next we're going to classify. We're going to start enumerating those technique variations, and I'm going to try to go through this quickly. So of the ones that were identified at the end of this research were the following: local HTA file execution on disk. And I've asked this before, are there any file extension limitations? Or can I just do evil.txt or whatever? Inline execution via protocol handlers like JavaScript : VBScript : We've seen some examples of that. Are there any more? Support for multiple scripting engines. All right. Again, we've seen that. Are there any more? How are those defined in the OS? How would I enumerate these supported engine components? This isn't really well documented anywhere, so I need to figure that out. Those polyglot files, right? There's another variation there. Remote execution via UNC pass is an option. I mentioned that lethal HTA project, so execution via COM and DCOM remotely and locally. Execution via emulation of a double click. I'll show you an example of what this looks like. This was interesting when I discovered it, that attackers were doing this. They were doing this to break process hierarchy so that you didn't have like a direct parent-child process relationship. Next, modification of the executor, like MSHTA.exe file name and or path. Yep. And I want to briefly discuss breadth and depth. So using this paradigm that we've been discussing, the way I think about breadth, so the breadth of your detection coverage increases with the technique variation count. Okay? So here you can see those 8 identified variations. That, to me, constitutes breadth of coverage. Depth of coverage increases as you develop more tests for each one of those variations. Okay, so let's put our detection engineering hats on and start thinking like an adversary. All right, so here is the contents of one of those HTA files. All right, you can probably see like some of the script code that's going on there. Nothing really malicious in here. This is just a test that I ran. But what are some things that stand out to you that perhaps an adversary might have some control over? Or what do they need in order for the HTA file to run? So like you probably need the HTML and the head tags, the HTA application tag. What are some things they might be able to control? Maybe that window state attribute, okay? That could be, looks like it's pretty convenient for them to like hide windows. Script language, okay? This one has VBScript. What other ones are supported? And then the actual script code, okay? So this is a pretty minimal HTA, and the things that stand out to me that an attacker probably needs, and of course we can validate this, is the script language and the script code, and then all the other syntactic sugar that's required to execute HTA stuff. Okay, we have another example here. All right, this time they're doing inline execution. Here's something new to me that stands out. So in the other examples you saw there's a VBScript colon and a JavaScript colon. Now we have an about colon. So when I was doing this research, like I didn't even know that was possible. One of our incident handlers was investigating something and noticed that an attacker was abusing this, reached out to me, and I was like, oh, like that's crazy that I didn't even know that was possible. So I was able to turn around some coverage pretty quickly in the test code to support this. Okay, so we've seen 3 different instances, right? What else is required though? Well, there's the executor, so MSHTA.exe, but that can probably be renamed and relocated. The script language is probably a requirement, and then the actual script code again, okay? So if we were defenders, what might be some of the most robust things that we would key in on in order to reliably identify this inline execution as HTA inline execution? Right, because couldn't this just be notepad.exe running? And then what about that about colon? What else is possible? Does HTA colon application have to be there? Right, so we need to be thinking about the things that an adversary has little to no control over and focus our detection analytics on that. Because otherwise it's just going to be brittle and subject to evasion. All right. Okay, so let's start thinking about possible optics that we could build detection analytics off of. Command line is pretty obvious. Now, just bear in mind, command line, an attacker generally has the most level of control over. They may not have complete control over that, and like we just discussed, what they may or may not have control over. So we have to be very considerate of that, because they exercise a heck of a lot of control over what they can supply at the command line. Next would be process path and file name. Right? An attacker has a tremendous amount of control over that. So are there any possible mitigating controls that could be used to identify when an attacker renames and relocates MSHTA.exe or rundll32.exe? Well, we could consider original file name. Raise a hand. Does anyone know what original file name is and would be able to explain that to me?
The property they showed was originally named.
Was originally?
It's just the property within the file.
Yeah, it's the property within the file that has the original name of the executable. Yeah, so like as a defender, why would that be useful? Like, why would that potentially be more robust to key in off of versus the process path and file name? Sorry?
Adversaries rename it.
Change the name of the original file name?
The binary. So
Right. So they might change the name of the file on disk, right? But it's unlikely that they're going to change the original file name in the executable, especially for a built-in executable, because in doing so, they would invalidate the signature. So then they might as well just be dropping their own malicious code. But thank you for answering that. Okay, so these are the identified original file names for MSHTA.exe and run DLL32. This is an extremely powerful analytic for defenders. If you can baseline this set of like known law bins, and if you're doing your detection logic off of original file name instead of the more naive like process path and file name, where you're baselining it against the two, right? So like you would expect MSHTA to be in system32 and syswow64, those directories, right? So if in your analytic, if you said, okay, we have a process event and the file name is foo.exe, but the original file name is mshta.exe.mui, well, that deviates from our baseline. So we'll detect on that. That's extremely effective. Okay, the script host DLLs. So these DLLs are, they'll be loaded depending upon which script host is executed. So you saw like the VB script : JavaScript : maybe these could be relevant in our detection analytics. I don't know. I'm leaning towards no because you can get you can get a lot of context from just command line and the original file name. But I consider everything, and then I just whittle down what is absolutely necessary to build a detection. All right, is parent executable path going to be relevant? What is HTA executing from? Is the parent process winward.exe? Is it explorer.exe? Is it PowerShell.exe? These are all going to be very, very relevant in our analytics. Is it making any external network connections? Does MSHTML.dll load? That's what implements that run HTML application function. This may be relevant, maybe not. I'm leaning towards no, unless we care about the instances where attackers implement their own version of MSHTA.exe, because that would have the effect of loading MSHTML.dll into an executable with low reputation, right? Or wouldn't be signed. But within the context of my scope, I don't really care about that DLL load, but I'm just trying to be exhaustive here in considering everything that might be relevant within the confines of our scope. Do we track HTA file writes? I don't know. That might be difficult because it's just a text file, and it could possibly have any file extension, right? So that might not be very realistic. Okay. So let's talk about atomic test harnesses. So here's where we're actually going to validate all these things and actually implement all of our findings from our research. So this is a PowerShell module that's up on GitHub. And the purpose of it is to validate all of our findings in a way that's abstracted such that you don't have to be a subject matter expert on MSHTA. You can just go read the help and flip all the relevant bits to invoke all of those technique variations without actually having to know how to craft the HTML code to execute everything. All right, so the underlying motivations to this was I can't detect what I can't see. Okay, so yeah, I could go detonate some malware in a sandbox. I could go run some red team tool, but those weren't designed with detection engineers in mind. I might get some good ideas out of it, but if I don't have something that I have like more direct control over, I'm not going to be as confident in what I'm able to see to infer detection logic. And what should I be looking at anyway, right? Like, as a non-subject matter expert on this, ideally, like, I really don't want to become a subject matter expert on HTA. Like, I just don't care. Like, someone else ideally should research this and just present me with what I really should be focusing on. And so that's what I aim to do in the functions in atomic test harnesses. Okay, and how do I distinguish technique artifacts from test runner and irrelevant OS artifacts? So this is really frustrating for any detection engineer. You go detonate a malware sample, like with a procmon trace, and then you have to go weed through everything and be like, is this like an OS artifact? Is this actually related to the technique? I don't know, maybe. I'll go run it again and see if it exhibits any patterns that might be related to the technique. And then whatever you run it in, that runner utility, is that generating its own artifacts that you have to like weed out too? So like this happens with like Atomic Red Team as an example. Like if you're running tests in invoke atomic test, like how do you discern PowerShell.exe running the test runner from the actual test artifacts? That had always been a perpetual challenge for me, and so this is something that I wanted to help solve. And then what does a successful technique look like? So in the case of HTA code, how do I know that the script code that was embedded in the HTA actually executed? For as great as Atomic Red Team is, like it's one and done. You go fire it, and then you have to interpret the results yourself. So you may not know confidently that the thing actually ran, even though it claims that it did, because it didn't shoot out any errors. But I really want to know, like, did the HTA code actually run? And so there's some automation and some like eventing in play to confidently know whether or not your quote payload ran successfully. And then how can I replicate a technique without needing to be a subject matter expert? Again, like I should just be able to go read the help on this function and know like what arguments I can pass to it in order to have some confidence that I'll be able to detect this without having to form the payloads myself. And then must I be limited to attack procedures supplied by malware authors or proof of concept like red team tools? Those are great for developing an initial scope, but they're not holistic. So we can miss a lot potentially. And then I also wanted to test one thing and test that one thing really well in order to confidently measure quantitatively what our coverage is for a technique. All right, so let's hop into the demo here. Come on now.
Did you do your sacrifice to the demo?
Oh man. Freezing up on me. Well, this is no fun. Here I had everything set up so beautifully. Well, all right, so I'll do my best to explain things while I try to reload this. So I've created a PowerShell function in atomic test harnesses called invoke ATH HTML application. And let me try to resume this here. This is where I pray. Man. Well, all right, so just gonna have to do my best to explain things here. So what you would do is you would run this function and it presents a ton of different options, right? So all of those identified technique variations that we talked about, that we identified earlier, all these here are implemented within that function in a very abstracted way. So if you wanted to execute an HTA file locally, it'll do that using HTA as the default file extension. But then it also lets you override that. So you can supply any file extension you want. So foo.txt, what have you. It also lets you supply any executor file name that you wanted. So you rename it to notepad.exe, test that out, and it would let you do that. So it supports all of these. Now, there's still a lot of parameters that it implements. And so with all those options, like it can be pretty easy to be overwhelmed. And let's say I just wanted to test our coverage on every one of those techniques, as well as all of these supported, like say script engines that are supported. Well, there's also unit tests implemented for that function. And so I want to say there's like 30 different tests implemented. Because for each of those technique variations, there's also like different parameters, again, like different script engines, different file extensions, and it tests all of those in an automated fashion. And so if you're getting green on all of those tests, then, well, one, you know that each of those executed successfully, and then you can go from there and then see, like, ask of your EDR, whatever your sensor analytics are, did I actually see that? And if you are, then you've really built that foundation of optics coverage upon which you can develop confident detection coverage. All right, so apologies that the demo did not work out. But you can go to the GitHub. Again, it's Atomic Test Harnesses. Try it out. Ask me questions. Manifestation on Twitter. So in conclusion, this methodology can apply to literally any attack technique. I focus on just HTA just because it was relatively constrained for the scope of this talk. But again, like, scope is key. You have to be deliberate in order to not become easily overwhelmed, okay? And MITRE ATT&CK, I have to remind myself of this, that it's a guideline and a reference. It is not like the gospel, and just because it says something does not mean it's true. If that's the case, like, please reach out to correct them. But they don't always get this, their scope may be more broad or too narrow for your use cases. So it really is up to you. Use it as an initial guide and reference. And scope is derived from the technical components, the level of adversary control that they have over each variation, the available optics, and whatever your available resources are as a detection engineer. Like, this is a relatively expensive process to squeeze this coverage out of any attack technique. And don't let perfect be the enemy of great. All right, there is no perfection in detection engineering. You're never going to have 100% confidence of anything because there's always going to be unknown assumptions in your logic. And then finally, confidence is misplaced without testing. Like, I could state qualitatively that we have confidence, but, you know, show me the money, right? Show me those tests that you're running to exercise all of the identified technique variations and all of the supported parameters for each one of those variations. And then do I see it on the other end? And if I see it on the other end, then I'm confident that my detection analytics are going to be resilient against evasion. So with that, I thank everyone for your time.